begin by asking you, what does the history tell us about the success of old CEOs who come back as new CEOs? Does it usually work or not?
Well, there are spectacular cases of success, and we all know what they are. There's Steve Jobs, there's Howard Schultz, there's a few other cases where everybody points to them. But actually, in 2020, the Sloan Management Review published some very good research by some professors out of actually UNC, and they looked at 167 cases of boomerang CEOs, as they're called. And the numbers actually would show you that it doesn't really work all that well. I mean, that in most of the cases, in the vast majority of the cases, that stocks underperform when CEOs come back. So there are these spectacular cases, and there are cases where CEOs really want to protect their legacy, and they go back, and that's the impetus, or the board calls them back for that reason. But if you just look at the sheer research, it's not as good a picture. In fact, it's a pretty negative picture.
Americus, does your research, do your views agree with what Suzy just cited? In other words, for every Steve Jobs or Howard Schultz, there may be 3 or 4 that don't work out?
I think that's correct, Tyler, because what we see is we see a self-selection sort of approach, that where we spend a lot of time focusing on the success cases, and we don't really hear a lot about those failures that Suzy's talking about. I would also say that what we're seeing is very much this idea of a new sort of world where generational cohorts are demanding that CEOs sort of build their own brands and come out and talk about purpose and what they stand for. So a big part of this process, Tyler, is really having these CEOs step back in to these roles because they have a brand, a strong brand, to be able to give investor confidence and to be able to really help push that comeback story. Whether or not that comeback story is going to be successful will depend on a lot of different factors, like Suzy is saying.
And Suzy, it's interesting in the case of WWE to look at the stock pop, which is because Vince McMahon also signaled, look, I want to be a decision maker at a time of what could be a lot of flux for media and streaming. I mean, there's reports about even our parent company being involved for this asset or other rivals, and the entire space feels wide open right now for a potential wave of M&A. So I don't know if that's a different situation where he feels as though he is uniquely the person to steer that, that epoch.
Well, this is the founder syndrome, right? And I do think that he feels uniquely that way. I think Howard Schultz felt uniquely that way, that their legacy is all wrapped up in this. They created it. They have the DNA of the company in their bones, and they are the only ones who can answer all the questions that need to be answered. It does kind of beg the question about whether or not these companies are bigger than their CEOs. I mean, if you buy into this, that only this person can come back and save us at this critical time, the way Steve Jobs did, right? Maybe Steve Jobs was the only person who could do what he did, and maybe Vince is the only person who can do what is needed right now. But I mean, I think I remember there was a period where people were asking whether or not Jack, my late husband, would go back to GE. And when I remember David Zasloff asked him this question at a function we were at, and Jack said, look, GE is just so much bigger than me, so much bigger, it was bigger than the CEO, and there's great people there. And that was his argument for just trying to put that to sleep right away. But there is this, as Americus was saying, there is this notion that you are the brand, you are the company. And whether that's healthy, that's a question for the boards to work on.
Suzy, as you often do, you have the courage to ask yourself the question that I was about to ask you, because your husband, your late husband, certainly would have been in a conversation should he return to GE during its era there where it was not doing so well. Americus, let me turn back to you and ask the question. Do these situations where the old person comes back, do they work better when that old person coming back is the founder? Can we extrapolate?
That's a great question, Tyler. I think that one would have an intuitive hypothesis that the fact that the founder steps back in. So if you take the example of Stick Fix, the founder created this. Mm-hmm. So Katrina Lake has a brand, a very powerful brand. She started the company in 2011 while she was doing her Harvard MBA, I believe. And so she has, as what Suzy's saying, the kind of understanding of how this thing started and has that understanding of the deep DNA that's potentially important with respect to bringing back success when things begin to plateau. So, even though it's a bit of a difficult stance here, because Katrina's stepping into the notion of having to immediately cut 20% of the jobs and maybe shut down a distribution center in Salt Lake City, she's the one to do that because it is her company. And so she can do make these kinds of difficult decisions.
Great point.
Because she is an authentic founder. And so stepping in, and even though her tenure will only be 6 months is my understanding, it's a way to kind of reassure that this authentic individual who is the founder will always want to do what's in the best interest of the company.
Stay on top of the latest in identity, marketing, branding, and pop culture by following Americus Reed on social media or learn more at americusreed.com.